Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and we are really excited about today's topic, whose fight is it anyway, and very excited to have with us Barbara Mitchell and Cornelia Gamlin. Barbara and Cornelia have lots of experience in the field, and I look forward to them sharing that with us today. And to give you a little bit of information about Barbara Mitchell and Cornelia Gamlin, in 2011, they started a writing partnership when they wrote the first edition of the Big Book of HR. And since that time, they've written additional books, including a version of a revision of the Big Book of HR, the Essential Workplace Conflict Handbook, and the recently released the Conflict Resolution Phrasebook. They also collaborate on a weekly blog, Making People Matter. They are likely to write more books in the future, and I look forward to that because the others have proven to be great references and great content. Both Barbara and Cornelia are influencers in the HR and business communities. They are frequent speakers to business groups and have been quoted in major publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Fortune, the New York Times, Forbes, CEO Magazine, the Globe and Mail, and Fast Company. They have been interviewed in major markets around the country and contributed articles to numerous blogs and websites. Cornelia and Barbara have both had successful careers as HR leaders in Fortune 500 companies and now consult with a wide variety of clients. So we're delighted to have their expertise on board for our webinar today. So I will turn it over to both of you.
Thank you, Beth. We're delighted to be here and to talk about this really, really important topic. We have a new book that just came out last week on the follow-up to a book that we wrote 2 years ago.
Yes.
On the both of these books are around conflict. So this is a topic that is near and dear to our hearts, and we'll tell you more about our books at the end of this session. But we just want to, first of all, if we could get to the next slide, please. Look at what our webinar will cover today. We're going to look at who owns the problem, and then facilitation and conflict management, when and how to get involved. This is a really critical issue. Knowing when to fight is just as important as how. That's the opening quote in our phrase book for this chapter on whose fight is it anyway. So that's what we're going to cover, and let's go to our first slide. We're going to do something today around a scenario that we think kind of sets the context for this problem, and then we'll talk about it. So first of all, let's look at who owns the problem. Every conflict is unique, and conflicts are never simple. So picture yourself in this situation. Jake and Beth Gilly, we apologize for using your name, but this is an actual scenario from our conflict management book. Jake.
Okay, forgiven.
Thank you. Jake works in spinning cubicles, and he drives her crazy. He constantly interrupts, talks too much, asks nosy questions. He plays loud music and refuses to wear earplugs. Frustrated, Beth finally goes to her manager, Sherry, and says, "Please do something about it." What should Sherry do? What would be your reaction to this if you were Sherry and this came to you? Next slide, please. If Beth brought the problem to you, what would you do? And then if you were the HR person, which I think many of you probably are on the line today, as an HR professional, how would you respond in either case? Is it your default, like many people's, to just try and fix the problem? Do you believe, as some people do, that HR should always be the problem solver? Next slide. So let's look at a couple of these options. If HR or Sherry does intervene, Could be a perception that they're taking sides between Jake and Beth, and that would not be a good thing in either case. And that can also then demotivate either one of the people. And of course, as a manager, you're taking their problem on, adding to your already busy work schedule. And there's something else that I think is really critical here, is you are not allowing Jake or Beth to be able to learn how to manage conflict. And isn't that one of the things that as a manager we ought to be doing for our employees? Training and developing them to be able to take on the role and solve their own problems. So I mentioned that we have a new book that just came out. It's using phrases, and we can go to the next slide. We have a whole book of 2,000 plus phrases for people to use when they find themselves in these situations. These are not phrases we expect anyone to memorize or use verbatim, but they can be just a prompt for you, and you're in this situation. Something like, why are you talking to me about this? Perhaps you want to talk to your coworker because we think that you need to solve it. I recognize there's a problem, but it's yours to solve. The problem won't work itself out. You both need to take responsibility for solving it. So this is the beginning of the context that we want to share with you today. And now I'm going to turn over to Cornelia, who will talk about some of the ways to work on this.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Barbara. If we talk about what role does HR play, or what role does a manager play, and this is an issue that's near and dear to our heart. And we were in a session one time and heard somebody talking about conflict, and it was after our book came out. And she seemed to have the opinion that every time a situation came to her as HR, she had to be the one that solved the problem. She was really taking on everybody else's burden, and we kept scratching our heads going, well, when do you get your own job done? So are we trying to say that HR or a manager never plays a role in a conflict situation? No, that's not what we're saying. But there is a very specific role that HR should be playing, or if you're a manager, and this is happening, with your teammates, the role that you should be playing. And it's really taking on some facilitation and conflict management. You as a manager, you as HR need to begin to learn that you have a very powerful position if you start to take on the stance of a mediator, where you're indirectly involved in the situation. Because if there's chaos going on in a department, you don't want people to be trying to interrupt each other. You don't want people to be getting in the way of other people getting their jobs done. But if you can start to facilitate discussions between your team members to help them solve their own problems, that's the very powerful position that you can be in. Conflict management really is about exchanging information, but in a conflict, emotions can run very, very high. People get frustrated, and sometimes that information doesn't get exchanged in a very meaningful way. So let's look at what the role of a mediator is on the next slide. The mediator really is somebody who helps other people not only solve the problem, but first of all, understand the problem. Oftentimes, people just don't know what the root cause of a problem is. The mediator plays an objective, neutral third-party role. So they have a role to play. They can get involved, but their involvement is helping the other people find the solution to their problem. One of the advantages of being a mediator or being a facilitator is that you're kind of on the outside looking in, and you see the issue from a different perspective or a different vantage point than the people that are involved in it. So you want to, as a mediator, encourage the two people to be talking, to be asking questions of each other, not of you. You want to keep the discussion on track. If people start bringing in other situations, that's when you want to step in and say, let's get back to the issue at hand. You want to encourage communication between the people that are involved in the situation so that they are starting to understand what the problem is and can begin to formulate solutions. And the important thing when we talk about solutions is it's not the mediator's job, it's not HR's job, it's not the manager's job to come up with a solution. They don't find it, they don't impose it. It's the individuals who are actually involved in the conflict that have to find a solution and have to agree that that's the solution that's going to work for everybody and agree to commit to that solution. Well, let's see what else a mediator can do on the next slide. I think no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Beth. I was looking at the wrong thing.
Okay, great.
All righty. So, some of the useful phrases then that you can use as a mediator to help to move this process along. I'll help you both find a solution that works, but I won't decide what that solution should be. We're at this meeting to find a solution, not to find fault. And that's a really good phrase if people do start some finger pointing with each other. Silence won't solve the problem. You need to talk to each other, not to me. And I think that gets an important point across to both people. Sometimes they just don't want to talk to each other. The problem's not going to go away if you just sort of sit and let it fester for a while. So people can understand that they've got to talk to each other. That can help get that dialogue going. And we've got a lot of other phrases in the book that are around dialogue and how to bring some of that dialogue out. And then finally, we're not here to focus on blame. Let's look at what happened. So if your job is not to get directly involved, are there ever times when a manager or HR should be getting involved? Well, of course there are. If an employee is having a performance issue, and particularly if that performance is impacting them or other people on the team, that's when the manager has to get directly involved. That's the time you want to start talking about what are the expectations that we have for the role that you're in. How come you're not meeting the expectations? This is where we see that there's an issue where you're not meeting expectations. And let's talk about that. So it's really defining what the problem is. Then as a manager, or if HR is helping to facilitate a discussion between the manager and the employee, you want to let that person know that because of their performance issues, other people aren't able to get their work done. So there is an impact that their lack of performance is having on everybody else who's on the team. And then finally, the last thing you want to let people know is what's next. If that performance doesn't improve, what are some of the things that may happen as you go forward? But this is a management discussion, and most of us that are in HR know you need to give constant feedback to your employees so that they know when they're not doing their job or doing it the way that the company expects them to be performing. And then there's another area where HR and managers should be getting involved, and in some cases absolutely have to get involved. If there are conduct issues, if there are claims of harassment, if there are claims of discrimination, and if there are claims of bullying, because sometimes bullying can lead to a lot worse of a situation in the workplace, such as workplace violence. So we all know that when somebody makes a claim of discrimination, the company is obligated to take certain steps to address that claim, and I'm sure you all have policies around that. And the same thing goes for discrimination. But these are some very specific areas where, as a manager, as HR, you absolutely have to insert yourself into the problem and it really becomes more of a management problem than just a conflict to coworkers. Let's look at some useful phrases that we can use. If somebody is trying to pull you into a situation that you want not be involved in. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. How to get involved. I'm getting ahead of myself now. We've talked about a performance issue and explaining what's happening and what the impact it's having on other people. You also want to explain to your manager or to your coworker if something's going on and it's observed by an individual, they need to know that their manager is there, and if it's a situation where somebody just isn't doing their job, then that's something that the manager has to get involved in, and that's something that the coworker can really direct that employee to do. If it's a conduct issue like harassment or like discrimination, most organizations are going to have some very specific reporting channels, whether it's taking that complaint to HR, taking it to legal, taking it to some other entity within the organization. And I think it's important that your employees understand this and understand that there is that distinction between conduct and performance issues and then other situations where people just aren't getting along in the workplace. We can play such a powerful role in HR if we can sort of guide people into the right direction. And when it's appropriate, when it's just, I'm not getting along with somebody because Jake's music is too loud, how do they stand up to Jake and how do they address that issue directly with Jake? Next slide, please. So as I was saying just a couple of minutes ago before I got ahead of myself, sometimes people try to pull you into a situation, and this happens a lot when you're either a manager or if you're in HR. They come to you as Beth did to Sherry and said, do something about it. If you're having problems, you want to speak to him or our manager, not to me. Don't look to me to referee this dispute between you and him. This issue doesn't impact me. It's not my fight. Your complaining isn't going to solve anything. Talk to someone who can, not me. And that, you know, that's such a human thing to want to do. You want to blow off steam to somebody else. And I think a lot of times people realize that. But if you're constantly blowing off steam and not going to the cause of the problem, that problem's never going to get solved. And then my very favorite is, I'm not in it. That was a phrase that a woman that I used to work with always used because she was the type of person who would come in. Everybody would come to with their issues, and she'd listen to them. She'd probably use one of these phrases, and then she'd come to me and say, I'm not in it. They've got to solve their own problems. So we've got, as we said, so many other phrases of things that you can use. We also have a section on things to never say in a conflict situation. And these are some of the kinds of things that could really just tick somebody off. I told you to do it that way. What a bunch of idiots I work with. Stop acting like that. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear you. It can't be done that way. Are you crazy? And of course, as we know, when we're in a conflict situation, emotions sometimes always get the better of us. So we need to understand that we have to listen for those emotions and that we have to recognize those emotions.
We have two chapters at the end of the phrase book that we had probably the most fun writing. If you can imagine writing books to be fun, and it can. But we have one chapter that's called, You Can Always Say This, And the other one is the one Cornelia just gave you some phrases from, but never say this. Some of the phrases that you could always say, some of the things that really can always move a conflict toward resolution. Probably the most important one of all is I'm sorry. There are times when that phrase, I'm sorry, can just begin a conversation because you are admitting, you or whoever is involved in the conflict are admitting that you do have some role in this conflict, and let's move on. Sometimes just apologizing, something simple, can move it forward quicker than anything else.
And the other thing about apologizing is that you also acknowledge that you played a part in this and you bear some of the responsibility for it.
So we hope that in the books that we've written on conflict and conflict resolution, we've given you some really practical information. We tried to use the scenario, we gave you one in this webinar, but the book, the conflict handbook, workplace conflict handbook, is also a series of those kinds of scenarios with real life situations and then how to resolve them. And then the phrase book gives you some of the things that you might be able to say to help you resolve the conflict. We just are very passionate about the idea that you have to really acknowledge who owns a conflict in order to resolve it, and not go to the default that many people have, that they just say, okay, I'll fix it, and then you realize that that's really not your role to fix. And it goes back to something that I said at the beginning of this webinar about developing your people skills, the skills of your employees. They need to learn. Like for those of you that are parents, you want your children to learn how to solve their own battles. You do want your employees to also have the ability to have some skills that they learn by doing. So don't take all of the conflicts on yourself. If it's your battle, take it. Of course you would. Of course you would do the mediation role. Of course you would do the facilitation role. But if it's not your conflict to solve, don't fall into that trap.
And another important thing that we touched on is trying to get to the root cause of what a conflict is. So many times people don't take the time to do that. They don't listen to what the other person is saying. They're just in so much of a hurry. They want to move this thing along. So we've given, in both of the books, in both the conflict handbook and the conflict resolution phrase book, we've given a lot of examples of how you can go about actually defining what the conflict is, what the problem is, because it's something else we feel very, very strongly about. If you don't understand what the problem is, you can't address it, or you may be addressing the wrong problem, and it still brings you right back to square one, if you will, where now we're talking about something that never did get resolved, and we've got now an even bigger problem because we didn't address the right problem in the first place. So there's a lot of good questions in the conflict phrase book that you can be asking to try to elicit good information from people and try to get to what the real problem is and not what other people's perceptions may be, because getting to those real facts is what is so critical in dealing with conflict resolution.
So we hope that we've given you some really interesting things to think about and some actions to take, and we'd be delighted to take any questions from you on this topic.
If you have a question, please feel free to type it in the question box that you'll see on the right-hand side in the control panel. Or if you want to click on the raise your hand button, I can just unmute you and you can ask a question that way. On the right side, if you don't see the control panel, you'll see an orange button at the top. The arrow is pointing to the right. If you point it to the left, it will open up the control panel button. But you can always just type in a question. And while we're looking to see if we have any questions, I was wondering, is there a time when HR should step in? I mean, it seems so hard to know when and where to get involved as you want people to grow and develop and be able to solve their own conflicts. And there are times in your experience that you've seen or thought, I really do need to step in here.
You know, Beth, as you asked that question, it just brought back to mind something I witnessed a long time ago when I was new to HR. There were two gentlemen walking down the hall and not just having a conflict, they were arguing with each other and yelling at each other and talking about, you know, whose experience was better than the other. And I mean, it got quite noisy. And I remember seeing some people like walking down the other direction and just scattering away. And my boss at the time, who was the HR director, just went flying out into the hallway and said, time to stop, knock it off, and escorted them back to their department. And I guess they had quite a session with their manager. But yeah, there are going to be times when you see or observe something where you've got to take some action, even if it's just to kind of calm people down and get everybody in a room and get them talking. But it still doesn't mean that you're the one that has to try to solve their problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And certainly if the issue is around harassment or bullying potentially, absolutely, positively, HR would be front and center in resolving, mediating those situations. Anything that has potential legal implications, you want to make sure that you were involved as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have any other questions out there? We still have a few more minutes. And I, of course, always have more questions, but I don't want to ask too many questions here. The other thing, while we're looking to see if we have any others coming, is I wonder, is there a role, you talked about the role of HR as a facilitator to resolve conflict. Is there a role for HR as a coach to help managers learn how to manage conflicts, say, within their department or among employees?
Absolutely. That's a great role that HR can play to coach managers, and especially before a manager gets in a situation like this. And I know that sounds ridiculous to think that you can anticipate when you're going to be in a conflict situation, but many times you can, that you kind of get a sense or there's some indications that it's going to be a difficult conversation, and HR can provide a valuable service to the manager. Even role-playing, practicing some of the phrases that we have in the book can help a manager get prepared so that when they go in, they have some ideas of what it is they're going to sell. So absolutely, HR can be a coach in those situations and really provide a very, very valuable service to the managers in the organization. And we hope that HR steps out and makes that available. The idea of role-playing, and there's probably better ways to say role-playing. I think the words role-playing seem to scare a lot of people.
Preparing,
just having a dialogue, a practice session, just using some real words, I think, can make a difference.
Mm-hmm. And that was really one of the reasons that we wrote the conflict resolution phrase book, was when you're anticipating a conflict situation, it's an opportunity to prepare, and it's an opportunity to get prompts around some things that you may want to say. You know, recognizing you may be more comfortable using your own words, but this will at least give you some ideas of the things that could say that'll be very effective, because we did really focus on positive things to say and not negative things to say.
Mm-hmm. So this could really, that kind of preparation could really help decrease the reactivity that flames the conflict.
Absolutely, yes. I believe that's one of the things that a good manager wants to do, is minimize the conflict, but we also want to make the point loud and clear that sometimes conflict can be beneficial in organizations because it can spark innovation and creativity, but it has to be done appropriately, managed properly, and we hope that the work that we have done around conflict can help the people on this webinar and others who see our books to really do a good job in managing conflict effectively within their organization.
Mm-hmm. Well, it looks like we're at 12:30, so it's time to wrap up. And I want to thank you, Barbara and Cornelia, for joining us today. I think you gave us lots of good things to think about, lots of ideas, and lots of meaty ways to go about resolving things and figuring out when to step in and when to let people and help people facilitate resolving things on their own. So I appreciate all your expertise in that. And Barbara's books, as you can see, Barbara and Cornelia's books, as you can see, are available through Amazon and are great reads. So thank you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Beth.
You're most welcome, Beth.
Okay. And we'll end here. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to email me, bagilly@lytleeap.com, or my phone number is 703-444-2254. 703-444-2254. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.